This is part two of the Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism. In this section, we're going to talk about the rise of the United States. Now, recall that we learned in the previous videos that Great Britain is where the Anglo model kind of laid its foundation, and it was based on the John Locke philosophy of individual rights, as well as the Adam Smith philosophy of free markets and open kind of trade. The United States took this idea of economic and even political and social freedoms to another level. Probably because of the geographical distance from the motherland, we were able to do things and liberate people in a way that would not have been possible in Europe. But we want to understand the United States because it's going to be probably the best template for analyzing the Anglo model today. And so let's do that. Let's talk about the United States. Well, the United States is considered the world's only superpower and is considered the most technologically advanced country in the world. Some people hear that and they're surprised. They say, well, the United States is technologically advanced, but so is South Korea, right? So is Japan. A lot of countries are very advanced. But what we mean here is not the utilization of technology. The U.S. actually doesn't utilize as much technology as some other countries, but we do spawn a lot of new ideas. In fact, one of our number one industries is technology, selling information, ideas to the rest of the world. If you look at the big tech companies today, most of them started here in the U.S. So there's definitely a fertile environment for technological advancement within the U.S. The U.S. is also considered a superpower. This came about militarily during the Cold War, especially in the 80s. The U.S. was ramping up its military allocation and building up a large array of weaponry, and the Soviets were doing the same. But the Soviets disbanded in the early 90s, leaving the U.S. as really the world's single most powerful military. The term superpower could also refer to our economic position. After World War II, there was an agreement across the globe. Most major countries started tying their currencies to the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar became kind of a de facto reserve currency, and it's maintained that status for a long time, even to today. What that means is that countries often trade with each other in U.S. dollars, not even in their own respective currencies. That gives the dollar a lot of influence worldwide. We inherited common law from England. That means laws are made, for the most part, by judges using the reasonableness kind of perspective, as opposed to civil law, which uses code, the government just determining what the law will be. Limited government. We do have a constitution that restricts government in the U.S. In fact, it's fair to say that the U.S. is one of the most limited governments in the world. The Constitution enumerates the powers of the federal government and creates three separate branches, executive, legislative, and judicial. And then the legislative branch is bicameral, meaning you have a House of Representatives and a Senate. Each branch is equal in terms of its power and serves as a check and balance on the other branches. This is designed to prevent one branch, say the executive branch, from garnering too much power over the others. The exceptionalism of the U.S. is the notion that we're a unique social, economic, and political experiment that was made possible by the confluence of events in the late 18th century, the late 1700s. To understand why the U.S. is the exception to the norm, it's important to look at the historical roots. Quick review: we were 13 colonies that were originally subjects of Great Britain. But remember, we're in oceans away, and that's going to give a lot more autonomy to the colonists than would have ever been possible to the citizens of Great Britain. We fought a war of independence from 1775 to 1783. This was based on taxation without representation. So the colonists were being taxed by the British government, but they didn't have the representation in Parliament to counter that tax or to have a say in their future. The Navigation Acts were another bone of contention. This was legislation that was designed to limit trade and the use of maritime vessels outside of the British Empire. In effect, the Brits wanted to control the navigation between Europe and the colonists, and that was very restrictive economically to them, and they felt that it was unfair. So there were other issues, of course, but these are two big ones that helped sow the seeds of discontent and led to a war of independence. The Philadelphia Convention, 1787, this was after we were victorious in the War for Independence, and we were trying to put together a government, a way of working together. I mean, you got 13 colonies that now have to kind of get along, forge trade among themselves, and more importantly than anything else, preserve a defense system so that they can have their independence, sustain their independence. So they get together in Philadelphia, and the original goal was to revise the Articles of Confederation, this kind of loose assembly that had been formed previously. But it actually led to a creation of a new government and a signing of a constitution. The Federalist Papers came out from 1787 to 1788, and these were issued to promote ratification of the Constitution by the colonies. This was the famous Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay narratives that tried to convince the different colonies and colonists to approve of the new Constitution and the new government. Well, eventually it happened. The Constitution was ratified in 1788. The Articles of Confederation ceased to exist, and we had a new country. Geographically, the country was still quite small. So in 1803, with a deal from France, we made the Louisiana Purchase, and this vastly expanded the U.S. Westward. I've got a picture of this here to show you. This is the original territory of the 13 colonies, and the Louisiana Purchase was this large sliver here in 1803. And then you can also see, this is a very handy map, see the other areas that were acquired over time. But the U.S. not only was acquiring land and creating an independent nation, it was also becoming a very attractive place for immigrants. You can see this in the following link. If you take a look here, click on First Wave. From 1790 to 1820, we're seeing immigrants coming from Europe, the English, the Scots, the Germans, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish. And then the second wave is from 1820 to 1860. These immigrants came here from Germany and Britain and Ireland. This is the period where there was the Irish potato famine. So a lot of Irish fled the poverty of Ireland to come here and, find a better life. And then the third wave is from Asian countries such as China and Japan. And most of the people that came from these countries were either fleeing persecution for religion or they were pursuing better job opportunities. And then the fourth wave is 1965 to the present, which is a broad array of people from all over the world. The ability to migrate to the U.S. And to other countries has increased because of international transportation and connectivity. But Hispanics from Mexico and Asians make up the biggest bulk of these fourth wave migrants. The point is that the U.S. had become an attractive place for immigrants for whatever reason. It could be to escape persecution. It could be to emigrate, that is, to leave a less desirable environment economically or politically. It could be upward mobility. It could be the opportunity to start a business. There's a lot of reasons, but the U.S. does attract a lot of people even today from all over the world. And in that sense, we're somewhat of a melting pot, a place where many people from all over the world bring their culture, their languages, but come together in a common way under the U.S. system. We did have a bit of discontent in 1861 through 1865, the Civil War, which was fought over slavery and over states' rights. There was a second industrial revolution globally, which began here in the late 19th century, which would be the late 1800s, it kind of mirroring what had happened 100 years prior in Great Britain. That set the stage for large-scale increases in GDP, mechanization, as well as higher per capita incomes. By the 1900s, the U.S. had actually surpassed the UK as the largest producer in the world. So that just means we had higher GDP by 1900 than the UK. And by 1950, we had the highest standard of living in the world per capita, and passing the UK. Next thing to do, now that we have this kind of historical backdrop, is to look at the model of the U.S. in terms of the many institutions that underlie these capitalist systems. And as we go through these, we're going to see the U.S. is distinctive in the way we manage our corporations, in the way that we regulate the business environment, in the way that we handle labor markets and our legal system and things like that. And then we'll do the same kind of analysis for later on for the European model and for the Asian model. So at the end of looking at these capitalist models, we can get a sense of where they are similar and where they're different. But let's start out here with the corporate governance of the U.S. model. The U.S. generally has corporations that are widely held, meaning there's a lot of owners and not usually a few controlling owners. You could have major shareholders, but the idea that you would have only 1, 2, or 3 owners of a corporation, a big corporation, is uncommon. Management is also separate from ownership. Most of the people that own shares in a U.S. corporation are not involved in the management. Shareholders are the owners of the corporation. They're represented by an elected board of directors who determine the management of the company. So the shareholders are the ones who determine this board of directors. They get to vote, and they select the board of directors, and then the board of directors puts the managers in place, typically the CEO of the company. So the CEO is accountable to the board of directors, who is accountable to the shareholders of the company. The shareholders, however, are the ultimate beneficiaries of the company's actions. They're the reason the corporation exists. It exists for their benefit. Stakeholders. A stakeholder is a non-owner. Notice the difference. Shareholders are owners. Stakeholders are non-owners. But these are people that are affected by the actions of the corporation. And it's multifaceted. It could be the managers of the firm, the employees, the suppliers, the buyers, anybody that is affected by the actions of the firm, the corporation, are considered stakeholders. This distinction between shareholders and stakeholders is going to be very important later on, because in the U.S., the corporation operates primarily for the benefit of shareholders. But as we get to the other models, you'll see stakeholders have a little bit more influence in the operations of a business than here. Management maximizes shareholder over stakeholder interests in the U.S. The goal is profit maximization, because that's what the shareholder really cares most about. When you have widely held corporations and the shareholders are not the managers, they buy shares for one reason. They want to get profit, and that means the company is guided towards that overarching goal, even if in some cases it comes at the expense of the stakeholders. Example of this might be, pushing down wages for employees would not be in the best interest of the employees. That would hurt the stakeholders, but that would be in the best interest of the shareholders. So in the U.S., you're more likely to see that kind of activity, pushing down those wages in order to get maximum profits. Whereas in a country that is more stakeholder oriented, it'd be harder to push those wages down to benefit the shareholders. Hostile takeovers. This is the involuntary acquisition of a publicly traded company. This often happens because of corporate raiders like Warren Buffett and these other guys here. They're always scoping the stock markets to look for undervalued stock, which is another way of saying that companies are being mismanaged. They're not reaching their potential. So they'll go in and they'll scoop up these low-valued stocks. They'll get 51% of the company and they'll fire the management and install their own management in there and raise the profitability and ultimately the value of the shares. So this is a bit of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, companies don't like to be taken over. The CEO is going to lose their job. They certainly don't want that to happen. But it does increase the accountability for mismanagement. Companies are much more likely in an environment where they could be rated to reach the potential, because there's always going to be that fear in the CEO's mind that, hey, if I don't maximize this company's value, somebody's going to come in and take it over and fire me and get that value. So it's a good thing from an efficiency standpoint, but certainly doesn't feel good for those that lose their job. That's it for this video. I will pick up with part 3 in the next one. Thanks, guys.